The busiest and most ambitious women with type 1 diabetes do everything right and still can't lose the belly fat. They have a successful career, they're eating kind of clean, they do some workouts, some strength training, maybe they're running, but they're still puffy and still stuck, unable to lose the belly fat. And what you need to understand that the reason for that is not the laziness, it's also not the genetics, it's biology. And specifically, it has to do with stress and insulin, which is the case for all people with type 1 diabetes, but especially as a woman with type 1 diabetes, this will be super relevant. Okay, so that's what we're talking about today. Will be super important, and specifically we'll talk about 3 levers to fix that and what's actually the issue with the whole stress and being ambitious as a type 1 diabetic and why that leads to you being stuck with losing belly fat. But I'll tell you a little story about a client that I've been working with this year. And she's coming to me, and the last 2-3 years she hasn't been able to make any progress. So she couldn't tone up her arms, her face, also her belly. Couldn't lose any belly fat anymore, and also with her blood sugar, right? It got better because she's ambitious, she is responsible, right? She's taken the responsibility for her blood sugar, so she's not denying the type 1 diabetes. She's quite ambitious about it, but still she can't go below 7 with her A1C, 7 percentage points. Okay. And then once we started working with each other over the course of 3 weeks only, she went with her A1C from 6.9 to 6.4, cut her insulin demand in half, and by eating more, she actually lost a couple kilograms only in these first 3 weeks. And again, going from 6.9 to 6.4 and got her time in range to over 90%. As you know, your A1C is the average of the last 2 to 3 months. So if she got that A1C down to 6.4 in just 3 weeks, then it will, right, obviously be even better if she tests that again within 2 to 3 months, just to emphasize how great that result actually is. Now, the main mechanism of why she couldn't progress, and why, if you're in a similar situation of being ambitious with your training, with your food, with your career, and losing belly fat, and why you can't progress, is usually the following. Okay, so here's what's happening in a type 1 diabetes body. So first of all, with your lifestyle choices, with your career, right? If you're kids at home, and on top of that, if you're then also ambitious with your food, with your training, and you have type 1 diabetes, all of that in a nutshell is stress to the body. So we know, for example, that when we're working a lot, right? 10, 12-hour days, even if you're working 50 hours a week and you're ambitious with your career, your lifestyle tends to increase cortisol over time, because that's the hormone that keeps you alert, right? That's the hormone that makes sure that you're attentive, focused at work, and that you can do things, right? That lets you wake up in the morning. But of course, if you're doing a lot, it will be increased a lot. The same thing is also done when you're training. Okay, so when you're working out a lot, or when you're attentive because you're watching things with your food, or for us with type 1 diabetes, constantly checking your blood sugar monitor, checking if it's too low, checking if it's too high, and then reacting respectively. So all of these things are stressors to the body, because you constantly need to alert. Now, as you can imagine, if you have kids at home, it's the same thing. You're constantly alert, because you essentially, right, if they're 3-4 years old, if they're very young, you are like constantly watching them, because they can't be on their own, obviously. If they're getting older, obviously it's going to be easier, but still you have responsibility over other human beings, so you need to be even more alert, and stress will be even higher. Now, add type 1 diabetes to that equation, which even for someone, right, that is, I don't know, 20 years old and hasn't got any responsibilities besides taking care of themselves, is a big stressor. Now, if you add all of these stressors to the type 1 diabetes, and that means specifically as type 1s, we don't just always have to watch everything and check our monitor all the time, and have the social stress and pressure of type 1 diabetes, being asked dumb questions all the time, but also when our blood sugar goes low, like below 60, below 70, and so on, every time it's a panic attack in our bodies, right? Every time we get this adrenaline, and therefore also a cortisol excretion, which means that it's every single time a stressor to the body, because our body literally tries to get back up the blood sugar. On top of that, it's a big stressor if our blood sugar goes beyond 180. So like that's in case you're using millimole units, it's when it goes out of range, right? 70 to 180 is this typical in range kind of spectrum. So every time that happens, inflammation increases for several days. So we're knowing that blood sugar fluctuations next to the whole mental stress is a huge stress to the body. So we shouldn't underestimate that. Okay. Now, if you add up all of these stressors, that can lead to chronic stress very quickly. Okay, and that's the point that I'm trying to communicate, and to give you also a bit of background about what that hormone cortisol does, because everyone's talking about that, not just people with type 1 diabetes, but a lot of people, because it's becoming something like that people are more aware about in the fitness industry. And the role of that hormone is essentially that it metabolizes like energy, as in it breaks down the glycogen storages so that you have sugar in your blood. So, for example, it makes sure that you can get glucose, sugar in your blood, because your brain runs on sugar, your body runs on sugar in general. It gets sugar in the blood from your liver, from your gut, from your kidneys, and even the transport of oxygen, right, in your body, right, the red blood cells, they need sugar, they need glucose to transport oxygen. So it's literally something that we're reliant on. We need that. So whenever there's stress, our bodies do more of that, right? They get more glucose in our bloodstream so that we can be working, that we can be functioning, our brain can function, we can think, we can get oxygen and so on. And the whole point, and why I'm explaining that and why that even is relevant, is that cortisol leads, like especially chronically increased cortisol, leads to insulin resistance. Okay, so that's a mechanism in our body, which means that whenever we have stress, we're more resistant toward insulin, meaning we need to produce more insulin to get the same job done. Meaning, when cortisol leads to our glucose in our blood rising, right, so that we can have more energy, that's kind of the antagonist of insulin, so we need to produce more. And the reason for that is that every time we have a lot of stress, our body is in that kind of survival mechanism, so it wants us to produce more insulin, right, to see our pancreas specifically to secrete more insulin, so that we're storing more, because whenever we're storing more, as in especially body fat and belly fat, we can survive better, right? Because the fat storages essentially are a survival mechanism for us. And that's why when we have a lot of stress, you can think of that as a survival mechanism, and that then leads to our body wanting to store more fat. And what's behind that is the insulin resistance, right? And what will happen for you if you're stressed, if you have a lot on your plate because you're ambitious, you're doing your training and everything, is that stress will then lead to you needing more insulin because of that survival mechanism, and you needing more insulin will lead to you storing more belly fat. And that's the whole caveat, and that's the whole difficulty when it comes to losing belly fat as a woman with type 1 diabetes that is ambitious, right? That has a lot of stuff on her plate, that is just stressed. And that makes it more difficult than like the average human being to lose belly fat. Okay, and then there's of course other factors depending on how old you are and so on and so forth. We also know, right, that estrogen dropping and progesterone rising throughout menopause feeds that insulin resistance loop, meaning it leads to more insulin resistance because estrogen increases insulin sensitivity. And then when you're in menopause and estrogen is decreasing and progesterone is rising, then of course it's also like happening within this cycle. And then of course this will lead to you having more insulin resistance and needing more insulin in that case. Okay, so that's what makes this more difficult on top of that, as opposed to a man, for example. Okay, so I think that also partly already answers the question of why doing everything right isn't working for you, right? But we could also argue that doing everything right isn't actually doing everything right, okay? Because healthy eating that is still not suiting what you need, for example, if you're eating quote-unquote healthy, but you're not actually considering the fact that you're stressed and that your cortisol is higher and that potentially you're in menopause, right, depending on how old you are, then it is just not doing everything right, because it's, for your scenario, it's not actually right, okay? Because if your meals are still random, still low in protein, and very, very common pitfall amongst women with type 1, if it's still too little carbohydrates, which I almost see every single day, then this is just not right for you, okay? having a coffee and throughout the day instead of actual meals, having too little snacks throughout the day, which then increases stress further. All of these things then, right, make it more difficult. Or even kinds of training, and I could list like so many examples of clients before working with me. They've done workout types, or like an approach of working out, CrossFit and so on and so forth, the whole gym classes, that then fed that stress loop even more. So it didn't make it easier, but harder for them to recover, manage stress, and improve like the insulin resistance. And when it comes to insulin resistance, also a quick note here, because it's misunderstood a lot of times. This is not like a switch from black or white. It's a spectrum, so you're somewhere on that spectrum. So you can be super sensitive toward insulin, and you can be less sensitive toward insulin. But that doesn't mean that when doing lab work, this will show you, oh, you're resistant toward insulin. It's always a spectrum. And the more insulin sensitive you are, the better it is for your overall health, and the easier it will make fat loss for you. So just because on paper someone says, okay, you're not insulin resistant, it doesn't mean that this spectrum isn't relevant for you. It doesn't mean that you can't improve on that. Of course, it can mean that you're very insulin sensitive, and that factor specifically won't be a big lever for you, but that's rather the exception, right? Because you're always somewhere on the spectrum, as I said, from super insulin sensitive to insulin resistant. Okay, so coming back to the point why doing everything right doesn't work, because likely it is just not right for your scenario, right? It is just not the right thing for your scenario, in which you need XYZ nutrients, and in the vast majority of situations, what that means specifically is undereating. Very likely you're undereating, or just not having enough of the right things, right, with the right timing and so on, together with the training throughout the day, because you're likely having too little protein, too little carbohydrates, these kind of examples. Of course, it's different in every scenario, but what happens, right, when you're, for example, eating less, is then that you will be more hungry, right? You're under eating one day, next day you're more hungry. You have more cravings, right? You have worse sleeps, you have more blood sugar fluctuations, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of this loop that then gets worse over time, because, right, more stress from under eating or from fasting and so on then also leads to more insulin resistance over time. So it's that loop that's making it more difficult. And I think, right, by now you should have a great understanding of, okay, what is this loop about, and how the stress impacts on insulin resistance, which for us, right, type 1 diabetics, just leads to us, we need more insulin in the first place if we have more insulin resistance, if we are on that spectrum of sensitivity and resistance, more on the resistance side, okay? Now, 3 things that are absolutely crucial. That's not what can you do about it, right? 3 levers that are absolutely crucial for you to support your body, right? To recover better, to make sure that you can manage that stress better, and therefore also help with the insulin sensitivity, is that we want to stabilize the mornings, right? Because, right, if we'll focus on 3 aspects for now, so we're going to talk about the most important ones. We want to stabilize the mornings, as in stabilize the blood sugar in the morning, because the breakfast sets up the rhythm, or sets up the blood sugar for the day. When that is already a roller coaster, in my example, I had probably, with the first 6 years of having type 1 diabetes, I had cereal in the morning. And if you have ever had cereal in general as a type 1, and or even in the morning, then you know this is going to be a blood sugar roller coaster, and it was for me every single day. So stabilize the morning. What you're doing here is you have protein first, 30 grams-ish of protein, at least 20 grams-ish of protein in the morning, which can be, right, cottage cheese, which can be smoked salmon, which can be a package of carpaccio, which can be even a shake with frozen berries, like a protein powder shake with frozen berries. And also some carbohydrates. And what I mean by that is that throughout the day, we want to have smaller portions of carbs throughout the day. So if we go back to the example of cereal, very quickly, this will be 80, 90 grams of carbs in the morning. That's too much, okay? You want to have, for breakfast and for the snacks throughout the day, or for lunch, 15, 20-ish carbs, right? Grams of carbs in tinier portions throughout the day. that will be great because it's easy to bolus for that, right? So you just have, like, you bolus, like however you need to bolus for carbs, you bolus for that in the morning, you have steady blood sugar, and you make sure that you actually have enough carbs. Because, right, as I mentioned before, when you don't have the carbs throughout the day, this will lead to your body doing that in another way. It increases cortisol to get that carbs or get the glucose from the glycogen storages of muscles, of your liver, of your kidneys, of your gut, and so on. And we, of course, want to not stress our body. So that what we're doing is having tiny portions of carbs throughout the day, right? That's the way to go when it comes to stabilizing mornings, okay? Tinier portions of carbs spread through the day. At night, you can then still have a bigger amount, but that's what we're talking about in a second as well. But first and foremost, making sure you have the protein in the morning, okay? That's how you stabilize blood sugar. And back to the client example that I gave in the beginning of the client, within 3 weeks, dropping her A1C from 6.9 to 6.4. She went from 8 units of insulin in the morning to 2 units of insulin in the morning, following that approach and stabilizing her blood sugar, having a lot of 100% time and range days, right? Which is super great. Now, that is not a direction for you, like how you should use your insulin. That's something that you discuss with your endo, of course. But just an example, right, on what that can lead to if you're actually following that approach. Okay, stabilizing your mornings, enough protein, and tinier portions of carbs throughout the day. Lever number 2 will be training like a busy person, okay, and not training like a pro athlete or not training like a bodybuilder. Training like a busy person, which can mean 2, 3. Right? If you're used to that, 4 strength training sessions, 40 minutes each throughout the week. Okay? Optionally, if you have more time, 20-minute intervals, 1 to 2. Okay? But starting with 2 strength sessions a week, 1 interval session a week is a super great start. Okay? You can think of your muscles, right, all over your body as like a glucose sink. You can literally like imagine that your muscles pull sugar out of your blood for days after you do that strength training session, which lowers your insulin needs in a lasting way, right? So the more muscle you build, and I'm not talking about being Hulk, I'm just talking about toning up, building some muscle over time. That doesn't always have to have like a visual effect right away, but also the muscle tone gives you that quote-unquote toned look. So that's also a great thing, right? That a lot of women that I talk to actually appreciate and feel very confident with. So, right, it lowers that demand for insulin. As you can imagine, if you need just half the amount of insulin for the same meal, then the chances of you going high or low are just way lower. Because obviously, if the demand for insulin is lower, and if you're kind of off, like by 10-20% with your calculations, the difference will not affect, right, your blood sugar that much, because you don't need that much in the first place. And as you can imagine, that makes the whole therapy just way easier. Okay, that's something that of course you should also coordinate with your team, as in how much you should reduce the insulin after a training session and so on and so forth. But then also, right, depends, and right, is very individual. And what I would also, right, highly recommend you to do, go to Instagram, go to my profile, go to my Instagram and send me the message protocol, just the word, and I'll send you a free training protocol that you can use and some simple directions on what you can watch with your insulin and everything to make sure that you're not dropping low and to make sure that this actually works for you, okay? Because then also the way you change up the insulin demands and everything, that highly depends on what kind of strength training you're doing. So if you're doing high weights with very low repetitions, like a power lifter, like 1 to 3 repetitions, then right, your sugar rather goes up. But if you're on the other side doing something, right, where you're doing like 12, 15 muscle endurance kind of workout, strength endurance kind of workout, then your insulin, like your sugar will rather drop in most cases, okay? So it really depends on what kind of energy producing system, so to say, we're using in our body, but depending on the type of training that we're doing. We all know that, right? As type 1s, sometimes we're taking a walk and blood sugar drops, and sometimes we're doing something really exhausting and blood sugar goes up. So, right, it's not always as straightforward as blood sugar goes low when we're working out. It's not always the case. And, right, that's like the second lever, actually working out is an absolute game changer. Okay, so if you only did that, that would change a lot. And lever number 3 will be protecting your sleep, right? As you can imagine, if stress is the big thing, and if we had to sum it up in a nutshell, stress is a huge thing for us type 1s, not just the blood sugar fluctuations, but also, again, if you're ambitious with your career and everything, this will, right, have a big effect on you. Protect your sleep like it's your salary, okay? Protect your sleep. This will be super important, which means cutting caffeine after 2 p.m. No more coffee. Maybe even if you're sensitive toward caffeine, green tea, black tea, something like that after 2 p.m. Also, have your dinner earlier and a lighter dinner. Eat the majority of the food throughout the day, like your snacks, your breakfast, your lunch, and then the lightest amount of food for dinner, okay? Have the majority of food throughout the day, the smallest amount for dinner, and finish dinner 4 hours before bed. If you sleep by 11 p.m., finish dinner by 7 p.m. Because then this will help you stabilize blood sugar, because you know that your insulin acts like 3-4 hours in your body. So if you inject like at 6:30 or 7, and then maybe 2-3 hours later something is a bit off, and then you correct, and then you can go to bed without having to like inject that huge amount of insulin for dinner 2 hours before you go to bed, okay? So that is something that is really important. The caffeine discipline and the dinner timing discipline, that will be important. And I actually don't recommend cutting carbs for dinner, but actually just make sure that you finish that dinner 4 hours before bed, okay? That will be important. Sweet. So that's the most important levers, okay? As I said, right, if you need more directions on the training, you're not already having a great routine at place, but even if you already have a routine at place, I would recommend using mine, because it's the best that you will find out there. Of course, it's not tailored to you, because obviously this is a general one, but that has worked over the last 7 years, right, with working with over 100 women in that position. So make sure to use that. It's like a really good protocol. Send me the word protocol on Instagram. I'll send it over. And that is right, the most important steps. So after all, if you're in your 40s, you perimenopause drops estrogen, increases progesterone, and that can also worsen insulin sensitivity, right? That's something that I mentioned before, something that adds to that whole loop of stress management. And that, by the way, also makes it, right, sometimes harder to manage stress, amongst other things happening throughout menopause. Now, that is something that on top of the whole thing, like work stress, training stress, and stress from type 1 diabetes makes stress management worse, something to consider as well. And then potentially with the training, you need to be even more cautious, like maybe just doing 2-3 strength training sessions a week and not going to 4. So that's also something to consider. After all, if you're waking up tired even after like a long night of sleep, or if your belly feels puffy or inflamed irregularly or in stressful periods, you have cravings at night, you need coffee just to function, or workouts feel harder than they should, or you sometimes even have a difficult time walking up the stairs, or it feels hard, then these can all be signs for that stress loop, right? And the stress therefore also impacting the insulin. So just something to consider. It doesn't need to be that bad, right, in order for this being relevant for you. But, right, these are typical signs of, right, when you're just over it, it's just too much, and your body screams for recovery and better stress management. Okay? So, after all, follow these 3 levers. Send me the word protocol on Instagram, then you're good to go. And otherwise, go scroll up, subscribe to the podcast, and I'm looking forward to the next episode.